The following interview is a presentation of Ofiɔ Media. Okay, well, I do now want to dive into Pentecostal politics specifically about 45 minutes into the interview. That was ostensibly just going to be about Pentecostal politics, but I feel like we've been having such an interesting conversation, so I didn't want to rush it.
Okay.
I'd like to start this section about Pentecostal politics with sort of a two-parter that's easy to ask, maybe not as easy to answer. Or maybe it is. Let's see. Describe specifically, if you would, what kind of power Pentecostal pastors in Nigeria tend to wield, and as far as you can tell, what the limits of those powers seem to be. And I'd like to just bundle that with also asking you to reflect on the symbiotic relationship between political elites and theocratic elites in Nigeria.
Okay. Oh, those are two great questions. So let me see if I can do justice to them. So the first one, you've asked it's interesting that I'm working on I'm basically putting together the final edit for my next book, which is on Pentecostal pastors. So remember, Pentecostal Republic is the first installment of a projected trilogy. So I've just finished working on the second installment. It's on Pentecostal pastors. And the reason I'm bringing it up, it's not to, I'm not trying to sell the book, but
feel free, by the way. Yeah, you can plug it.
I'll let you know when it comes out. But since you asked about, the power of Pentecostal pastors, so I describe them in the book, the forthcoming book, as what I call the contemporary pastor an existential micromanager. Now, what does an existential micromanager does? Well, it says it's on check the back of the bottle, right? He is in charge of every aspect of the life of the congregant. So the pastor is the one that people go to if they want to get married. The pastor is the one people go to if they want to leave the country. The pastor is the one they remain in touch with after they've left the country. The pastor is the one they look up to for advice on who to vote for, right? The pastor is the one. An existential micromanager basically is in your business, right? Meaning that he has such tremendous hold, as I argue in the book. It's not just that the pastor, controls public policy, that he controls the future in terms of prophecy, that it controls the present in terms of his, hold on, the members of the political elite, but also that he basically pervades the moral imagination, right? He's everywhere. You can't do without him. He's even trying to let you know how to react to the Twitter ban, as I just said. So the fact that the pastor is everywhere, I think, is the most important thing, which raises the question, why? So the argument I develop in the forthcoming book, the title of which is Clerical State, by the way, so the argument I develop in Clerical State is that the vacuum left by the evacuation of the intellectual elite is what the clerical state has stepped into. You can put it much more in a much more banal, much more crass way like this. Where the professor used to be, the pastor currently is. So I try to I go in depth in the book, trying to understand, how the crisis, why Nigerian universities, used to be among the best in the world, producing, just two or at least three generations of excellent scholars, how the bottom fell out of the universities, and how the rule of the intelligentsia based on reason has given way to the rule of pastors based on revelation. So that's the argument, in clerical state. But so part of what I'm trying to do there is to basically answer your question, to account for not just the visibility of the pastor, but it also is ubiquity, right? You can see him, but you can see him everywhere. Why? What is he doing there? Because he's in literally every facet of people's life: social, cultural, economic, political, ethical, and moral. So I think that's the first part of your question. The second part of your question is about the relationship between the political elite and the theological, the members of the theocratic class. So the answer is to be found in what I told you earlier, right, regarding how Buhari became president. So he was seeking political office, but he realized that in order to stiffen the spine of his candidacy, he needed to recruit. Not only did he need to recruit one member, of the Pentecostal elite, member of the theocratic elite, he also needed to cultivate that, that constituency, and that's the kind of compact that exists between them. So Goodluck Jonathan, for instance. So let's go back to Goodluck Jonathan, who preceded Buhari in office. Remember when he lost the election, in 2015.
Mm-hmm.
The election was supposed to take place in January, and then overnight, I think like a week before the election or a matter of days, the election was postponed until March.
Right, I remember that.
So I remember I was in New York when that happened. I was like, what's going on? Of course, so I got on the phone, I called people, and I knew I then discovered what was going on. For those 6 weeks, my friends, those 6 weeks, Goodluck Jonathan spent more than he had spent on the entire campaign. Right? Where did the money go? Wonderful question. Churches, political leaders, religious leaders. He went around churches himself in Abuja. So this is, I relate this in Pentecostal Republic.
Right.
And you don't go to those places in order to just go and kneel down, which he did, by the way, which is important to the question we're trying to answer. Like, one of the reasons you gain political advantage is to subordinate yourself, to members of the spiritual elite, which Jonathan did, excellently. But you don't just go and then say, oh, it was good seeing you guys. Thanks for praying for me. Yeah, see you around. No, you donate to their campaign, as they say in the United States, right? You donate to their campaign. So that's the kind of economy that exists between members of the political elite and members of the theocratic, the theocratic elite. But there's another very interesting dimension to it, which is
I want to hear what you're going to say, but just to stop you to clarify. So you mean that members of the theocratic elite are basically receiving state funds or state resources under the table from the political elite?
That's one side of the traffic. Sometimes so deep are their own pockets that they fund political campaigns.
Okay.
So
gotcha.
Let me give you an example, right? Which is in the next book. I keep mentioning it because I want you to buy copies of the book. Anyway.
Oh, I will. Don't worry, I will.
No. So when the current governor of Kaduna State, Ahmed El-Rufai, when he was running for office in the first term, he needed money to run his campaign. Who he reached out to? Pastor Tunde Bakare.
Huh.
He loaned him, I don't know what the dollar equivalent is, but 150 million naira.
Wow.
That was what the man of God gave to the prospective man of the state, right? To be paid back upon, winning office, of course, which he did. And according to Bakare, the money has been paid back in full. Whether it was paid back with interest, we don't know. Right, but that's the kind of traffic, that you're talking about. But the other point I was going to make, which is, I think this is also a nice jumping off point for you, which is that members of the theocratic elite themselves don't mind becoming, members of the state. Right. So if you look at Tunde Bakare, for instance, who, by the way, he has told his congregation that God has assured him that he's going to be Nigeria's next president. So the larger point is that once you have the kind of cachet, the kind of, power, that you have, within your congregation, and you have the kind of resources that they have, then you ask yourself, what next, right? What next usually is political office. So you leverage social influence in order to, to get political capital. But do you always succeed? The experience of Jonathan tells us not always, right? So we shouldn't take it for granted that because pastors have such considerable influence on members of their congregation, which they do, we shouldn't then take it for granted that that the congregants live in permanent subordination, or that there is no room for dissent, or that they cannot disagree with their pastors. They do, right? And as I argue in clerical state, some of the dissent, some of the resistance tends to come from the most unexpected places, particularly women.
I want to pick up on something that you mentioned in your response. You wrote in an op-ed in the Premium Times called 5 Theses on Nigerian Pentecostalism, which came out a couple of years ago, but I think after the book Pentecostal Republic. Yeah. You wrote that some Pentecostals subscribe to a worldview in which, and I'm quoting here, human agency is either completely absent or, when present, exists in sufferance to the untold machinations of invisible evil spirits, works to undercut the very idea of democratic accountability. Yeah. This reminded me of a quote from Pentecostal Republic, where one politician is praising another politician by saying, and again, this is a quote, "She understands that without God, she can't do anything." Yeah. And the person goes on to say that, in effect, a good Pentecostal politician allows themselves to be a vessel of the divine will, rather than sort of an agent driving change that they have envisioned themselves. What kind of an effect does this attitude have, this attitude toward politics have on public discourse? And a related follow-up question, in his 2014 book, Nigerian Pentecostalism, Dr. Nimi Wariboko describes a rather widespread belief in Nigeria, or in Nigerian Pentecostalism, that the country is fated, or destined, I could say, to lead a global wave of Christianization. Would you mind also reflecting on the effects that this sense of destiny has on public discourse and politics?
Yeah. Okay. So let me. The first part of the question is how this what you might call this occultic mentality, thinking has on politics, and you can think about it this way. So, if I say, oh, if somebody comes to me, so let's say you and I are Nigerians, right, and you hold a particular public office. And somebody comes to me and says, "Oh, have you seen Adam's house?" And I said, "What should I say about it?" "Oh, do you know his salary, yearly income, is $50,000, but he's just built this, $500,000, house." And I say, "How did he do that?" Right? And I try to hold you accountable. And you say, "Oh, I did it, but it was the devil that made me do it." Right? Once I believe in the power of the devil to control you, then I more or less, you're more or less, there's nothing else to do. Do you see what I mean? Because I'm basically saying it's not in your power. Poor you. By the way, I should actually pity you, right? And that's the way that, that mentality works. You ask me what it does to public discourse. At the very least, it pollutes it. And it makes any kind of rational deliberation almost impossible, because so let's say rational discourse is this stream in which all citizens struggle for equality, right? That everybody must, and then somebody comes and pours sewage into it. Once sewage enters it, everybody gets out, right? And that's the way sometimes that understanding, a spiritual explanation, for human agency, that's the way it can operate. And politicians are aware of it, right? They say, "Well, I didn't mean to do it," but there's also the phenomenon, of what I call ostentatious humility, right? And Goodluck Jonathan did a lot of this, and I mentioned that in Pentecostal Republic, where you go to a church and you kneel down before the pastor and you say, the burden of the state is so heavy. This is not, I know you all have voted for me, but this is not a task that an individual can perform. Please pray to God to help me perform this task well. Once you do that, it becomes almost impossible to hold the same guy to account for anything. Remember, he has already told you that he couldn't do it, that it's within God's power, to do. So that session, the seeding of control to unseen forces, which feeds on this, widespread understanding among the public that there are unseen supernatural forces, not just driving politics, but driving entertainment, students taking exams, the police on the street, man-woman relations. That understanding becomes, a problem, and so that's the effect. I think it has on public discourse. I think Professor Wariboko is right. About the whole manifest destiny thing as it relates to Nigerian Pentecostals ambition to basically Nigerianize global Christianity. But I would just add a footnote to that, and I'm sure it's a friendly footnote, which I'm sure you will agree, which is that in itself is a spin of a deeper political understanding among Nigerians everywhere. So not just Nigerian Pentecostals, not just Nigerian Christians, Nigerians, period, think that they were born to dominate the world, right? That it's the best country in Africa. Nigerians, have what is called the manifest destiny. So in a sense, you can think about Nigeria, and compare with the United States, the whole notion of manifest destiny to rule the world. Nigerians believe that their own manifest destiny is to rule Africa. And you sort of see it in the, where Nigerians are, and I say that as a Nigerian, we're very aggressive, we don't like to be contained, within borders. We are always the people who are spilling over. There's a boundless, energy, a bottomless sense, entrepreneurship, among Nigerians. So that's coming from there. So if you go back, if you have time, if you read some of the things that Nigerian nationalists, Azikwe, Awolowo, and all these people wrote about Nigeria, underlying it, was the idea that God created Nigeria and he created it for one purpose, to lead the rest of Africa, out of the darkness of colonialism, and post-colonialism, and basically birth the day, that glorious day when all is going to be fine. Which is why Nigerians lament, this is the other side of the coin, that the country is not doing so well. They lament the fact that, look, we are the ones who are supposed to be doing this thing. We can't collapse. 1 out of every 4 Africans is a Nigerian. You have to get up, take up the mantle, arise and fulfill the destiny that God has set for you. So that's how sometimes the political feeds, the religious, and the notion that Pentecostals would Christianize the world, and spread the fruit of Nigerian Christianity. I think it has that, salient political underpinning.
That's really fascinating. Thank you. I want to pick up on something from the first part of your answer when you were talking about sort of invisible spiritual forces, okay. and drill a little deeper there. Excuse me. In Pentecostal Republic, you describe political Pentecostalism in Nigeria as intent on demonizing all things traditional, and simultaneously, specifically, portraying Pentecostalism or Christianity more generally as kind of locked in this existential struggle with what people might call satanic forces or jihadist forces or what have you. This notion that Christianity is simultaneously, on the defensive, but also on the attack, right? Where there is this kind of manifest destiny to Christianize or to Pentecostalize or to Nigerianize. Can you talk about this tension between defensiveness and being on the attack?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So the way get out of Nigeria for a moment and think about what I've described elsewhere as a competitive religious marketplace, right? So let's say Walmart is one religious denomination, right? And think about all the infinite number of competitors that Walmart has in the United States, and they're all competing for one thing. They want to get their hands into our pockets. What do you do, right? I tried to project, that my product, what I'm selling, is superior, what the other, what the other is selling. And that's the way to think about Christianity playing offense and defense in Nigeria. So there are three competitors in the Nigerian religious marketplace. There's, broadly speaking, Christianity, there's Islam, and there's what you might call, indigenous, Orisha, there is indigenous Orisha religion. So there was indigenous Orisha religion. It was the first. And then came Islam in Western Africa. And then later, came Christianity. So Christianity was already, when Christianity came, it already found itself, it had to compete, right? And one of the ways in which I think it competed and did successfully was to demonize the other, right? So that process of demonization is what I was referring to. Christians saying not just that this is the only book, but that Jesus is the Son of God, and this is the only way. That theological conceit, right, which Islam has, the two global religions, right, that mine is the way, yours is not the way, yours is not the way, mine is the way. That is exactly, what's going on. Traditional religion, I think, is, much more, indigenous Orisha religion is, I think, much more liberal, in the sense that maybe it also comes from, the security of being somewhere first, and thinking that you have the guarantee that you cannot be ousted. So, but what we have right now, and I think, which is, sociologically very interesting, that neither Islam, especially in the western part of the country where I come from, nor Islam is itself free of indigenous Orisha religion. In terms of, some of its practices, that such is the way in which things have been unfolded over time, that pure Christianity only exists on paper. Pure Islam only exists on paper. The more people realize the challenges of attaining that purity, the more Christians go on the offensive. Do you see my point?
Yeah.
The more they realize that Puritan, that entity, that the subject that is completely Christian and that has no trace of Orisha religion or Islam, it's not possible, because remember, you came late. You of all these three competitors in the market, the market was already there before you. So it's in that context that this constant vacillation between playing defense and playing offense, has taken place.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, you see so many examples of this. I mean, if just observing sort of Christian practice in a place like Nigeria. I remember, when I was in Ghana, which has sort of very similar Pentecostal tropes. For example, seeing on TV, somebody, a pastor was selling a prayer book with, these very powerful hymns for warding off marine spirits. And it's interesting because you can look through the Bible and arguably not really find mention of marine spirits, but then
exactly
in local indigenous religion,
but everybody that the members of the audience understand and can relate to the existence of marine spirits. So
precisely. In Pentecostal Republic, there was one thing you said that that I didn't actually understand so well. So I wanted to ask you to elaborate on it, if you would. You described
let's see if I understand it myself.
I think you will. I mean, it's mostly a direct quote. So let's see. You described Pentecostalism as, this is the quote, a ballast that gives Nigerian democracy some degree of stability. Would you mind expanding on that?
So this is, I think this is what I was trying to say. So if you look at the current, so look at what we have right now. Who is the vice president of Nigeria? Is a Pentecostal, right?
Right.
Shimbajo is a member of, the Redeemed Christian Church of God. He used to pastor his own church. is on what he stands for, whether we like it or not, is that he has to continue to stand for the stability of the country, right? You understand? So because Pentecostals themselves are ingratiated with members of the political elite, in terms of their overall sensibility and their understanding of, the country and the state, they are essentially one. So that's the first thing. The second thing, which I think is actually, maybe it's also much more interesting, is remember part of the reason why Pentecostalism is so successful is that it has a theory of history, right? Pentecostalists say, this is the way things used to be. This is the way they are. This is the way they are going to be. God has told us, right? You can't bail on a prophecy, of which you are a part, right? So part of what is going on is that Pentecostals themselves have taken ownership of the Nigerian narrative, right? The current democratic dispensation is part of that narrative, and part of the assurance that many of the leading lights continue to give people is, at the end of the day, all will be well. And that's why I call it, it's a very interesting way to think about Pentecost, that it becomes this stabilizing force. It becomes this stabilizing force also in a larger sense, that pastors continue to project the message, that God is in control, that God is in charge. If God is in control, everything is going to be fine. And if God is in control and everything is going to be fine, why would you do anything to go and disrupt the system? If you don't disrupt the system, what happens? The system continues to exist. So that's what I meant by, Pentecostalism being, being this thing, that gives the democratic system, an unexpected solidity.
Yeah, it's such an interesting paradox, because I feel like reading the book, it's like example after example of ways that, Pentecostalism is eroding sort of the liberal potential of the democratic state.
Yeah, and then I surprise you with that conclusion.
Right at the end. Yeah, it's really cool, actually. Let's see. I want to ask you sort of, I guess, jumping back to the question before, or two questions back, talking about religious pluralism.
Okay.
And I'm going to take a long sort of winding path to arrive at my question. So I'll appreciate a little bit of patience.
Okay.
I'd like you to reflect on how the situation that you describe in your book, in which church power, let's say Pentecostal church power, has not only grown, but actually metastasized into the realm of political power and state power, how that situation that you describe relates not only to Nigeria, but to Ghana as well. I ask because I think your work is relevant to Ghana, having spent some time there as a journalist, but I think that it may not make it onto the radar of a lot of Ghanaians, because if they hear about you or your work at all, they might just think, well, this guy's writing about Nigeria and not Ghana, so it doesn't apply to me. Before you answer that question, this is the part about religious plurality now that I'm getting to. During my own time in Ghana, I frequently heard Ghanaian Christians making, different kinds of anti-Muslim statements or Islamophobic statements. And often enough, if I challenged them on these statements, they'd invoke what they might call, the plight of Christians in Nigeria. I don't mean to do air quotes, meaning that there aren't Christians suffering in Nigeria, but they would use that to defend making sort of unnuanced Islamophobic statements. So in short, I'd love it if you could spell out for a Ghanaian audience as well as a US audience, how your work on Pentecostalism in politics relates to Ghana. And, having just opened this can of worms, it's probably only fair to mention that, as you say in the book, in Nigeria, there are indeed examples of discourse in the political realm about making Sharia law into the law of the land in certain areas. And as I think I mentioned earlier in the interview, you also have rather muscular attempts by some Christians and Christian groups to co-opt the state or certain state institutions for purposes that are deemed important according to sort of a Pentecostal logic. So sorry for such a long question, but specifically about Ghana, if you can.
So So the first part of the so let me speak specifically about Ghana, and then I'll try and broaden out. So there's a history of comparing Nigeria and Ghana. So if you go to the political science literature, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, so there's considerable profit to be had, from comparing Nigeria and Ghana, because the two countries are almost like Siamese twins, in a sense. They became independent around the same time. They had, the political turnover from civilian rule to military rule at the same time, and they've sort of gone through similar challenges in terms of the economic development. There was a time when the Ghanaian economy was in the basement, and Ghanaians were everywhere in Nigeria, until the Nigerian government under Shagari foolishly decided to send them away. And then the Ghanaian economy recovered, and then Nigerians are the ones trying to buy apartments in Ghana now. So there's something to be said for that. With the important caveat that Nigeria is a country of 200 million, maybe more people, with almost 400 ethnic groups, rather clamorous, if you will. And Ghana is I'm sure my Ghanaian friends will understand it. It's a smaller country. It's a smaller
space. It's a demographically different state.
It's different. And Nigerian, jollof is manifestly superior. So just to throw that in.
I think that and if I could just comment there, I think it's because the Nigerians don't consider the shito, the black pepper, to be part of the dish when the Ghanaians serve it.
But you're on the right side of the argument, my friend. Yeah.
No, but if you include the shito, I think I have to just put in my 2 cents that the Ghanaians may take it.
Yeah. So thank you. So there is profit to be had from comparing both countries. But the key thing, I think, the key element here is the power of the theocratic class. Daniel Obinim, I'm blocking out on the names. I mean, all of them. It's basically the same. And the kind of relationship that they have with the political elite in Ghana is similar to the relationship that the theocratic elite in Nigeria has, with the political elite. The other thing is also to think in terms of the relationship that members of the Pentecostal elite have with ordinary people, with their congregants, and it's more or less the same thing in Ghana. So you find development within states, civil society, and the public sphere in general, kind of running along the same tracks, whether you're talking about Nigeria and in Ghana. So it's in that sense, looking at those countries, comparatively, and studying development in them, can be very generative and can be very productive. But as I said, this is not just about Nigeria and Ghana. So if you look at the introduction, I think the prefatory remarks, in Pentecostal Republic, try to say that, look, the specific constellations, that I'm trying to describe are not just African, not just Nigerian. So I mentioned South Korea, for instance. I gave the example of South Korea. I gave, the United States, and maybe I should do a bigger study of comparing, the influence of, religious forces on politics, comparing with the United States, Nigeria. So I'm trying to suggest that, if to the extent that my work illuminates the dynamic interaction between religion and politics within a specific African context, it provides the same illumination outside, not only outside Nigeria, but outside Africa as well. And that's one of the interesting things about studying religion and politics. You are more or less studying the same phenomenon, but within different sociological, and ethnographic particulars. Like, the particulars might be different. The agents might be different. You might get to the Ukraine and not understand the language, right? You might go to Russia. But once you look at the question, what does the theological look like in this context? What does the political look like in this context? What is the nature of the traffic between the two? If those are your questions starting out, then you apply the same question everywhere else, while noting, of course, because you're looking at, different, social formations, different, historical precedents, different balance of forces, that there will be, differences. But once you take that for granted, it can be very illuminating, studying, religion and politics. What was the second, the second part of your question? I'm trying to remember it now.
Yeah, it was about Islamophobia.
Yeah, I don't
and
like
sort of like Christians in Ghana, I guess, taking.
Yeah, I'm very dubious about the word Islamophobia, right?
Okay.
Yeah, because it's like saying Christianophobia, right? So there can be legitimate criticism of Islam, and there can be objective hatred of practitioners of Islam, right? If you are of the latter school, you're guilty of Islamophobia. Do you see what I'm talking about? But if you criticize Islam as a religion, that's not Islamophobia, right? We don't call people who criticize democracy, democraphobia. Do you understand? There has to be a space in liberal societies for criticism of all ideologies, secular, religious, cultural, whatever ideology it is important that they be open, to criticism, right? But that's separate from hating, disliking, mobilizing against people on the basis of their religion. Do you see what I'm talking about?
And I think my question was more along the lines of that I've heard comments that people will say something like effectively you shouldn't fraternize with Muslims because you can't trust them, they're violent, you see the way they kill animals, killing a human being is no different to them.
I see what you're saying now. That you have that, but the interesting thing is, so coming from Nigeria, but you don't just have it across religious lines. You have that across ethnic lines. You have it within ethnic groups. So I'm Yoruba, but I belong to a subgroup among the Yoruba. My wife comes from another ethnic group. And in theory, our marriage is supposed to be a disaster, right? Because they are the evil ones and we are the good ones, and if you go to them, they are the good ones, we are the evil ones. And I'm trying to suggest that those criticisms sometimes they appear to have a religious valence, but they are not really about religion. It's just about the other, right? And I'm saying the other can be an ethnic other, can be a religious other, but it can also be a sub-ethnic other. Look, if you grow up where I grew up, right? These are people among my sub-ethnic group. People from the other street are not to be trusted, right? So what I'm trying to say is that people always have this way of drawing lines. We're coming back to the thing about identity now, like always having, drawing these identity line circles, around themselves. And sometimes, those circles have, an ethnic coloration to them. And then sometimes they have a religious coloration to them. But it's important to keep in mind that once you, pare back those, colorations, it's always about the other, that is different from an essential we, that is, of course, always pure.
Yeah, that's a very informative answer. Thank you so much. If we have time, I want to ask you a couple more questions about Pentecostalism, then a couple general questions, and we'll finish.
Okay, let's do it.
Great. All right. Let's see. Got to ask this one. In an op-ed entitled "The Pastor as Sexual Object," you wrote about the Pentecostal pastor as being, and I'm quoting here, the throbbing center of an intense Pentecostal sexual economy. I think you touched on some of what you said in this article earlier when you were talking about the Pentecostal pastor as what you call an existential micromanager, which I think is an amazing term, by the way. But I wonder if you'd be willing to kind of expand on that observation, specifically with regards to this idea of the pastor as the center of a sexual economy. Yeah.
So that's, by the way, there's a chapter in the forthcoming book that that deals with the idea of the pastor as an object of affection, right? And the argument I'm trying to develop there is, So if you look at, the pastor, right? He, as I said, if he's an existential micromanager, then no domain, is close to him. He has access to everything. And the claim I'm making with respect to the idea of the pastor as an object of, erotic, attraction is that he controls everything, including sometimes access to the bodies, not just of women, but also of men. So in Ghana, there was this particular, the example of, I think it was it Obinim? I think
he
so.
does a lot of sort of
stuff
so
like that. So he was the
yeah.
guy who asked, all the male members of his congregation, who had, erectile, dysfunction, openly they brought out their members. The members brought out their members in church, and he was basically massaging the members to basically restore, their masculinity. Such is the way in which the pastor can have access to the innermost, the resources of members. But towards women, I think that's the more interesting thing, which is that you find, so there are, I'm trying to remember the exact phrase I use in the book. I call it instances of extracurricular copulation by extracurricular copulation by members of the theocratic elite. And basically, I was talking about all those instances of those guys basically having their way, with the woman, and oftentimes with the cooperation of the woman. And I'm trying to sort of reflect on, what's going on there. Part of what is going on is that people completely entrust themselves, women entrust their bodies to the pastor. And such is the entrustment, by the way, that resistance is frowned upon. And this is the interesting thing, not just by people, generally, but by female members of the church. So there was a particular instance of a pastor in Abuja who, as it turned out, was having his way with his, female members of his congregation. And one of them eventually said, no, I can't do this. The criticism, which I think, which is part of the point I'm making, is that it was other members of the church, female members of the church, who, addressing the woman, said, how dare you? So basically, how dare you not give our pastor, right, what we think is entitled to? So the erasure of the individuality of the woman and the enhancement, can't think of a better word than this, the enhancement of the masculinity of the pastor, is what I find, interesting there. So, but the other thing is the way in which the fact, because the pastor has become this, hyper visible person, he has become a big man. So I think there's a literature on, the idea of the pastor as a big man. And what does the big, if you are what does the big man have, right? The big man has access, to everything. And in the context of generalized economic insecurity, political precarity, young people not having jobs, the pastor, who, as I claim in my next book, rules by prodigy, basically has the wrong way, right, in terms of access, to the bodies, of female members of the congregation. So that's the idea, I was trying to put across there.
Yeah, it's I mean, there's a lot there, and I think just picking up on something that you mentioned just in the very end of your answer, I'll just throw it out there, and you can respond if you want to, but you're not obligated to, because I'm sensitive to the fact that we've already been talking for a while. In that same article that I just cited, "The Pastor as Sexual Object," you also have a quote where you say the rise of pastoral calling as the quickest route to social prestige.
Yes.
Well, you go on and you say that it's critical in a context in which the need to be somebody has become very acute.
Yes.
And
So thank you. So if you're a young man, so let's say you are a university graduate in Nigeria, you have very limited options. There's been a crunch in the labor market for at least 40 years, right? The latest numbers I saw from the Nigerian, labor statistics, 50% of Nigerian undergraduates are unemployed, right? So you have very limited options. What can you do? You can join a political party. If you're lucky, you can find, a job you can find formal employment. Good luck with that. With the era of digitization, you can create content online, as many are doing. But you can also take to criminality, right? You can, which many do, or you can travel, which I did, right? You can try to leave the country, look for better opportunities elsewhere. But there's this other option that has come up. You can become a pastor. Little training required. All it takes, right? You don't need any official credential. All you have to say is, have been called by God to become a pastor. And then you become a pastor. You set up your own church, which is why I argue, in the forthcoming book, that instead of procuring a series of credentials, that the ultimate credential is becoming a pastor. Because once you're a pastor, you are beyond censure, right? You can generate resources, accumulate resources within a serious period of time, and then you can become someone.
Yeah, it's really
so
interesting.
if you are considering job options, I would recommend it.
I'd be lying if I said I didn't have one or two friends who have gone that route from my time in Ghana. So yeah, I understand perfectly. Okay, I want to sort of open it up and now zoom out from political Pentecostalism and look at some broader questions. And also, you mentioned in one of your recent answers that a lot of the kind of relationality between different sort of identity markers and stuff that you talk about in the book is not at all specific to Nigeria, but that looking at the way these things operate in the Nigerian context can help us understand what's happening in, as you said, in the US and South Korea and in a lot of other places. In that book, Pentecostal Republic, you noted that prosperity gospel theologies tend to emphasize what you call the heroic achievement of the individual. I'd like to now pivot and actually ask you to comment on the United States and our political mythos here, where I think that this idea of the fascination with the individual, the desire to identify and kind of lionize and follow a hero figure is very much a part of our political culture. I don't know also if you read Gary Young's recent piece on public art and on the idea that sort of like the statue of the heroic individual is actually kind of bad, lazy public art because it just trains us to think further in this kind of savior context or the savior paradigm.
I didn't read it.
Okay, well, forgetting about that, I mean, if you could just sort of comment on the way that individualism functions in the American political mythos and whether that relates or not to the kind of Pentecostal notion of individualism.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So American individualism is an extract, it's a specific iteration on liberal individualism, right? So there is individualism in Canada. If you look across the developed world, Europe, Germany, I mean, there is, because to the extent that these are liberal democracies, right? The difference in the United States is the United States just has a specific view of it. And I think that goes back to the way the country was founded, who founded it, and the geographic, cultural, and economic context in which it was founded. And I think that it's so I think that point, is worth making. But the other point I would like to make is to try and defend that, right? Because most people think that they say, oh yeah, Americans take individualism, too far, right? And I'm always saying, well, you can never take individualism too far, once you understand it, because it's never the opposite of being communal, right? to the extent that I understand it, what the individual within the larger liberal project is trying to do is this, right? That I am first and foremost committed to myself as a human being, that I can disagree with the group, that have a right to free speech, have a right to association, have a right to religious expression, you know the rest. And that when there's a clash between me, what I see to be right, and what the community seems to be right, that at the end of the day, the things have to be weighed in my favor, right? And you can see where that, I mean, so I think individuality in that sense cannot, liberalism, liberal democracy, in that sense cannot exist without that kind of individuality. When people criticize individuality, I think what they are criticizing is different. And I think what they are criticizing is selfishness, right? And I don't think they are necessarily the same thing, right? So if I tell you, for instance, if I say, Adam, I'm going to sit in this room all day and I'm not going to leave. And you'd say, oh, but I need you to come and work with me at 3 p.m. or 4 p.m. And I say, I have no interest in that. I'm not being selfish, right? If you insist that I should work with you and you make me do it, then you're being selfish, right? The core idea, that I think the individual within the broader liberal project is trying to defend is that at the end of the day, it is the individual that is the source of dignity, of integrity, which is why when we think about something as seemingly, something like the United States Declaration of Human Rights, right? Human rights belong to everyone, right? Adam enjoys it because he's human. Ebenezer enjoys it because he's human. If I were in South Africa, I will enjoy it. If I were in Australia, I will enjoy it. So in that notion, there can be rights that attain to, even when I enjoy certain rights because I belong to a group. So let's say, we're giving professors of sociology this right. I will still have to enjoy the right as an individual. So at the end of the day, within that broad, liberal conception, you can't but always come back, to the individual. My criticism of Pentecostalism is that at the end of the day, the only individual left standing is the pastor, right? Because the rights of the individuals within the church are basically outsourced to the agency, the control of the pastor. Is the one is the existential micromanager, right? So it is in that sense that I'm claiming that Pentecostalism, apparently modern in its apparatuses, in its artifices, in its noises, in its drums, in building, websites, in being transnational, tweeting, is actually profoundly anti-individualist. Do you see the claim I'm making there?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, that's my point. I'm defending the liberal project against the Pentecostalist ethos, if you will, as an answer to your question.
No, that's a very insightful answer. Thank you so much. If we have time for a couple more.
Okay, go ahead. Let's do a couple more. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. When Omoyele Sowore was imprisoned on what many consider to be trumped up charges, you signed a letter, and in fact, in the version I saw, you appeared as the first signatory on the letter calling for his release. This was, I believe, in 2020, maybe 2019.
Yeah.
Would you comment on the impact that the work of a transnational news outlet like Sahara reporters can have on a democracy like Nigeria's? And then would you also comment on Sowore himself and his place in Nigerian politics? And I'll just mention for the sake of our listeners, Sowore has run for president in Nigeria in the last election cycle.
Yeah. So before I do that, full disclosure, is my friend. Do you still want me to? So I have this terrible habit of saying very good things about my friends. So
I'll still be curious to hear what you think about him.
So he's my friend. I like his work. I understand what he's trying to do. He was arrested because he called for a revolution in Nigeria, which President Buhari decided to take literally as an assault, on the Constitution. I don't think Sowore meant it like that. He was talking about revolution in the way in which President Buhari himself had spoken about it when he was running for office. When he said, we need a revolution in Nigeria, and people didn't think that he was going to launch, a military assault on Aso Rock.
A coup d'etat. Right.
Exactly. It was so Sowore, was speaking in the same sense. And his website, Sahara Reporters, has been one of the. So if you put, Sahara Reporters, Premium Times, if you're looking for reliable news, on Nigerian events, news that you will not find elsewhere, or news that, people would rather you don't know, or that you don't find out, those are the places, you are going to find them. So what I said is very interesting as a political agent. You may not know this, but he was a student union leader, I think at Lagos State University, he was a student union leader, and then left Nigeria, like many young people, came to the United States, worked, several years, in the United States, and started, this newspaper. I'm interested in him in terms of his evolution, as a political agent, and hopefully, in the course of time, I hope he ends up in a place where he's able to exert, some influence on policy making, whether within the matrix of public office or within a think tank or, just within the, the larger civil society. It's one of the, it remains a very, the least you could point out to about Sowore is his courage, right? That is there, he's been beaten up, he's been arrested. I don't even know his current status. I think he's out on bail and he can't leave Abuja, the federal capital. So there's an attempt there on the part of the government to cripple his business. But if this is the Sowore I've always known, I don't think you can expect a let up anytime soon. I think he's going to continue on this, very heroic and very commendable political path.
Thank you so much. One or two more quick ones. You've written in Pentecostal Republic, and I think in one or two op-eds also about the sort of power of homophobia when deployed by politicians as sort of a red meat issue to capture the attention of certain voters, and more importantly, to distract their attention most often from other issues that are of some kind of material interest to them personally. I wonder if you'd say something also about the way that homophobia and anti-gay laws are used, for example, in US media and European media to seemingly discredit African countries or their inhabitants or their kind of political spheres, or maybe even Africa itself as an entity.
It's what you said, that they're two sides of the same coin, but both are valid. So one is that there is what in the literature is called political homophobia, right? Where you basically target, these sexual minorities because, well, you are counting on, a moral understanding, which says that they're evil, what they're doing is unnatural, and they are un-African, right? So, which is why, I point to this unusual constellation of the media, the church, and the state in Nigeria. They don't normally agree on all things, but for the most part, they seem to agree on this one. And that's what is driving, that demonology. From an American context, part of what frustrates me is sometimes there's a refusal to see that one, it's the struggle, for homosexuals, to be able to be who they are and to be able to, marry, as they want. It's not completely won. Right. So when you read in the media how, Africa is this, backwater where, gay people are not safe. It's true, gay people are not safe in Africa. Everybody knows that. But it has to be put in context, in the context of humility about how hard, pro-gay rights activists, have had to fight, in Western context to be where, the society is currently. And to also admit that the battle is not yet won, and that there are problems, that, people are still, trying to struggle with. Having said that, given, from you'll be interested, I think, in within a religious framework, to also understand that part of what attracts American evangelicals, part of what they find attractive about Africa is the very hostility towards homosexuality, right? So there is this construction of Africa as the last place on earth where at least the devil has not completely taken over, right? Where, Satan hasn't yet reigned and appropriated the culture the way apparently it has in America, where everybody can just do, whatever they like. So there's a lot of investment by, American evangelical, institutions in Africa, moral investment, cultural investment, financial investment, basically that's not the explanation for disgust, hostility towards homosexuals in Africa. It has its own autonomous existence, but it contributes, American interest, evangelical interest, contributes to that.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I think worth it for people to remember that the U.S. is not just this force of what's the word I'm looking for? Spreading human rights.
Yeah, but just an understanding that there is a history to where we are, and that we need to have some humility, and that we're not there yet, to the extent that there is a there that we're all going, that those struggles are ongoing, and that sometimes it helps to put things in historical context, when you look at other societies and other communities.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. My closing question, I'd like to ask you to reflect on a 2016 op-ed that you published in Premium Times called Kids in Need of Desks, A Continent in Need of a Moral Overhaul. This was a piece ostensibly about the TV host Lawrence O'Donnell raising a bunch of money that would go towards supplying Malawian school children with desks. In that piece, you lament the representation of Africa as this kind of inherently dependent entity. Can you speculate on how this kind of thinking or how this perception could be challenged?
I was trying to actually address more of the other side of the coin. I recognize what you just said about the portrayal of Africa, but that piece was also written out of frustration. If you read it carefully. So I used to watch, at that time, Lawrence O'Donnell's channel, and they started this thing about kids in need of desks, I was like, oh, this is interesting. So it's the African country, Malawi, right? And while but what worried me, what I found frustrating, was the fact that this was 2019, 2018, like 2-3 years ago, that kids in a school in an African country that could afford to have decent public infrastructure, the kids had no desks. So what I was trying to do was push back, criticize the political elite, in Africa, to say, look, come on, maybe if you don't have trains that can go from Cape Town to Johannesburg in 5 minutes, maybe you don't have the bullet fast trains like in China, people will understand. But like, come on, guys, desks in schools, you can afford that. And then I was trying to then raise a larger question about, so why is it that those desks are not, why would you need a TV host in the United States to buy desks for your school? So I was trying to call attention to the problems around corruption, mismanagement of public funds and resources, and other things that if you study Africa or you go to Africa, that you are familiar with, but that things that would not normally come out, in that context. So if you donated, if you were interested in Lawrence O'Donnell at that time, I was basically saying much more than. And he got all the money he wanted. He was able to raise funds. He did a lot of good. He went to that place. He made the kids happy. But those are desks, right? That desks have a life, term, right? They are going to collapse. So what happens, 5-6 years after that initial purchase? Are you going to need another TV host to replace the desk? that at some point, where do we begin to ask fundamental questions about the agency of Africans themselves, right? As a way of humanizing them, right? Asking the same questions that you ask about schools in Mississippi, right? Like, hold on, how much was allocated? Who raised the taxes? Who got the contract? What did they get? Why wasn't it delivered? I think sometimes asking those questions are much more important. That I am not suggesting, my friend, that was not a good thing. You're not hearing that from me. That was great. It should have been backed. It was. But beyond that, I think we have to ask questions about why is it that there were no desks in a school in Malawi in, two decades into the 21st century? That was my beef.
Yeah, very understandable. And yeah, I mean, it's a sad state of affairs, but
Yeah.
We'll have to keep watching and see how things develop. Dr. Ebenezer Obadare, thank you so much for your time. This has been an incredibly enlightening conversation.
It's been nice talking to you. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.